Okay, welcome to chapter 6. This chapter is on memory. So let's start by defining memory. Memory is an active system that receives information from the senses and then puts that information into a usable form and organizes it as it stores it away. And then also part of memory is the ability to retrieve that information from storage. So to summarize all of that, memory could be summed up as the process by which we encode, store, and retrieve information. So let's take a look at some of the theories developed to explain memory. So we're going to start by looking at memory from kind of the cognitive perspective, or the idea that our thoughts really drive our behaviors and that our brains operate similarly to a computer. And so the information processing model really uses this computer analogy to explain how the brain works, and specifically how memory works. So we spoke about encoding, storage, and retrieval, the three main components of memory. And encoding could be analogous to a computer keyboard. And in the same way that we type information into a computer through a keyboard, we take information in using our senses and encode that information into our memory. And then in the same way that you can store information on the hard drive of a computer, you can store information in your memory. We would refer to that as storage. And that information that's stored obviously can be saved for future use. And when you want to obtain that information for future use, you would go ahead and go into the retrieval aspect of memory, which is recovery of stored information. And that would be analogous to kind of how the screen works on a computer. So in the same way that you can retrieve information from storage and memory and then view it sort of in your mind's eye, you can retrieve information from a hard drive and then view that information on the screen of a computer. So with encoding, this is the initial process of recording information. And what's important to remember throughout this entire lecture is that if the information that is coming in through the senses is not memorable, not meaningful, not important to you, then it won't be recorded properly and possibly not recorded at all. So, for example, you have seen the stimuli that I'm about to mention several times throughout your life, hundreds of times, thousands of times perhaps. But you might not remember the specific details of these items because when your brain was observing them through your senses, those details of those items were not necessarily important. So your brain didn't encode the details. It didn't bring the details of those items into your memory systems for storage. So if I were to ask you which color is on top on a stoplight, not a stop sign, a stoplight, hopefully you would be able to know that one should be red, right? But how many rows of stars are on the U.S. flag? So how many rows of stars are on the U.S. flag? You've seen the U.S. flag hundreds, possibly thousands of times in your life, but maybe your brain didn't think that it was important to remember how many rows of stars were on the flag, so it just didn't record that information. In other words, it didn't take that information into memory. It didn't encode that information. The correct answer is actually 9. There are 9 rows of stars on the U.S. flag. The next item you've seen thousands of times is a dime, the coin for 10 cents. So the question is, whose image is on a dime? And is this person wearing a tie? So you've seen a dime hundreds, maybe thousands of times, the little coin. Whose image is on the dime? And is this person wearing a necktie? The answer is Roosevelt and no tie. So the reason you might not have known that, even though you've seen this coin a lot in your life, is because your brain didn't find that information important, so it didn't encode it. It didn't take it into memory. Okay, next question. What 5 English words besides "In God We Trust" appear on most U.S. coins? What 5 English words besides the words "In God We Trust" appear on most U.S. coins? The answer is United States of America and the word liberty are the 5 English words besides "In God We Trust" that appear on most U.S. coins. The reason you may not know that, even though you see coins every day, is because your brain didn't deem that information important, so it never encoded it. And the last question, in the northern hemisphere in America, when water goes down the drain, does it swirl clockwise or counterclockwise? In the northern hemisphere in America, when water goes down the drain, does it swirl clockwise or counterclockwise? The answer is water drains clockwise in the northern hemisphere. And again, if you didn't think that that was important, your brain never took in the information, it never encoded it. Okay, so that's encoding, and just to give us a working definition of storage, storage is the maintenance of material saved in memory or holding on to information for some period of time. It's important to note that if the information wasn't encoded properly, it won't be possible to recall it from storage, of course. And then retrieval is getting information that is in storage into a form that can be used. So memory and storage being located and brought to awareness is retrieval. And one of the main reasons that we have difficulty remembering things is often due to just an inability to retrieve that information. And we'll talk about that process later on. So it's important to remember that we need all of these 3 parts, encoding, storage, and retrieval, for our memory to function properly and to enable us to remember. Another theory in memory is called the levels of processing theory. And this is a model of memory that assumes that information that's more deeply processed or processed according to its meaning rather than just the sound or physical characteristics of the word or words will be remembered more efficiently and for a longer period of time. So the idea is that this theory of memory emphasizes the degree to which new material is mentally analyzed. In other words, the amount of information processing that occurs when you're initially encountering the material will determine how much of that information is remembered. And then also, the greater the intensity that you process that information will increase the likelihood of remembering it later. So what is meant by the intensity of processing is just the degree to which you're analyzing the material, to which you're considering it, which you're relating it to your life, you're thinking about it. You're not just trying to remember a word, but instead you're considering what that word actually means. And what we pay attention to is what gets processed on a deeper level. So it enters memory on a deeper level and is less likely to be forgotten. And there's actually 3 levels to this theory. There is the shallowest level, or the shallow levels, and this is when the information is processed merely in terms of its physical and or sensory aspects. So like looking at the shapes that make up the letters in the word dog, or hearing the phonetic sounds of the D and the O and the G and those words being put together. And then there are intermediate levels of processing, and this is when you start to process that information into meaningful units, when those shapes become letters and those letters become words. And now duh, and then the O sound, and then the G sound actually come together to mean dog. And then at the deepest level, that information is being analyzed in terms of its actual meaning. So a dog in relationship to cats or other mammals. And you might even form the image of a dog in your mind, and then think about if you ever had a dog or dogs you have seen and how that relates to your life. Okay, let's watch a quick video on the levels of processing model in memory. let's return to thinking about the information processing model, which has a three-system approach to memory. It has a sensory memory stage, a short-term memory stage, and then a long-term memory stage. But here we're going to talk about that sensory memory stage. And so sensory memory is the very first stage of memory. It's the point at which information enters the nervous system through your sensory system, so eyes, ears, nose, so on. And it's really the initial momentary storage of information. It only lasts a brief moment, an instant. And there are two types of sensory memory that we're going to discuss. There's actually sensory memory for all your senses, but the two that we're going to discuss, because they're perhaps the most researched, is iconic memory and echoic memory. So iconic memory is memory for your visual senses, so visual sensory memory. And this memory lasts up to 1 second. However, there are some people that can store iconic memory longer, and those people often are referred to as having a photographic memory, or technically what's called an eidetic memory. So the way that we learned that iconic memory lasts for only about 1 second, and also another thing we learned was that in that 1 second, that memory is perfect in your mind's eye. So it's a perfect representation of what you just saw. And the way that this was discovered was by this man, George Sperling, who did an experiment in 1960. And what he did was presented letters on a grid. So there were 3 rows of letters with 4 rows in each letter. And when he presented these letters, he asked people to remember what they saw, but he only would present the letters for the length of the iconic memory, 1 second. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually try to replicate this study. So I want you to get out a scratch piece of paper, and I'm going to flash a grid of letters at you, and then I want you to write down all the letters that you remember seeing, and then count those, and we'll see how many letters you remember seeing. But I'm only going to be able to flash the grid for the length of iconic memory, which is just 1 second, and this is true to how George Sperling did the experiment. Okay, so you're going to see a countdown from 3, 2, 1, then a grid of letters will be flashed at you. Look at it, try to remember the letters, and quickly write down what you remember seeing. As fast as you can, write down what you remember seeing. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you wrote down some letters there and count them up. What will happen is in a little bit I'll reveal some information about that first set of letters. But go ahead and write on your scratch paper a number 1 next to those letters you wrote down. We're going to call that trial 1. And we are going to try this experiment again under a little bit different circumstances. So now to test George Sperling's theory that the whole grid of letters is actually stored perfectly in your iconic memory for 1 second, what he decided to do was tell his participants that if they heard a high tone, they were to write down the top row of letters. If they heard a medium or middle tone, they wrote down the middle row of letters. And if they heard a low tone, then they were to write down the bottom row of letters. And this was showing us that that whole row of letters is actually stored in your memory, but generally without those tones, we're just going to write down the first letters that we see on top, because in America we read from top to bottom, left to right. But when we use these tones, they are basically providing a cue for us to recall the corresponding row of letters, which means that we did actually have the entire grid of letters stored in our memory. So let's give that a shot. I'm going to have the countdown 3, 2, 1, and then it's going to flash another grid of letters for 1 second, and then again write down as many letters as you recall. But this time you're going to want to listen for a tone and write down the letters that correspond with that tone. So if you hear the high tone, when I flash the grid, then you're going to write down the top row of letters. And the high tone sounds like this. If you hear the medium tone when I flash the grid of letters, then you're going to write down the middle row. And the medium tone sounds like this. And if you hear the low tone, you're going to write down the bottom row of letters, and the low tone sounds like this. Okay, so get your pens and papers ready, and you're going to see the countdown, hear a tone, and get the flash of the grid. Ready? Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you have written down your letters, and we are going to try this again. So you can mark those letters down as number 2. We're going to try it one more time. Again, write down the letters that correspond with the tone that you hear. High tone, top row, medium tone, middle row, low tone, bottom row. Okay, here we go. This is going to be trial 3. Okay, so that was trial 3. Hopefully you wrote down some letters. And now I'm going to reveal some information about each trial and the correct letters that you should have written down. So this was trial 1, the first one we did without any tone. So usually people get about 4 or 5 letters right, and usually it is the top row of letters that they get because we're reading from top to bottom, left to right in America. But by the time we start writing down the letters, our iconic memory, since it's only 1 second, has gone away. And so we're not able to get the entire grid. But remember, George Sperling says the entire grid is stored in your iconic memory for that 1 second. And to demonstrate that, we flashed another grid of letters and this time associated it with a tone. So trial 2 was this grid. And here you heard the low tone, so you should have written down TWSL, or the bottom row of letters. Again, showing that the whole grid was in your iconic memory for 1 second. And as long as you had that cue, you could kind of search in that iconic memory to find the information. And this was trial 3, where you heard the medium tone or the middle tone, so you should have written down KDNL. Again, showing you that all those letters are stored in your iconic memory for 1 second. As long as you're given a cue, you can pull the correct information. So the next type of sensory memory we're going to discuss is echoic memory. And this is memory for your ear sensory system. So the brief memory of something someone just heard. It stores your auditory information for anywhere between 2 and 4 seconds. And this explains what we call the what phenomenon. So the what phenomenon is when someone asks you a question and you say what, and then you answer your own question. So maybe they say to you, Devin, what would you like for dinner? And you go, what? Oh, tacos, before they even have an opportunity to respond. And this is due to echoic memory. In the time you're asking, what did you say? That your echoic memory is reciting it back to you. So you're hearing what they said. And that's why you're answering the question without giving them an opportunity to speak again. So echoic memory allows us to remember something that was just said long enough to recognize the meaning of the phrase. Okay, so that was sensory memory, and now we're going to talk about short-term memory, which is the memory system in which information is held for brief periods of time while it's being used. And this is where the information first has real meaning, because now you're consciously and actively considering the information, whereas with sensory memory, it's all happening unconsciously. Short-term memory, people often speak about incorrectly. They'll say, oh, I can't remember what happened 2 weeks ago. I have a horrible short-term memory. But that would be a misuse of the term, because short-term memory actually only lasts about 20 to 30 seconds. Now, there are a few exceptions, which we'll talk about coming up, but as it is uninterrupted, it lasts about 20 to 30 seconds. So the way that information gets from sensory memory to short-term memory is through a process of selective attention. So in psychology, we call this the cocktail party effect, which is the idea that you're at a cocktail party or any party, and it's real noisy. However, you're able to hear someone talking about you from across the room. You pick up on your name or some information that you deem important. And this is due to selective attention. Your brain's ability to pick from all that sensory input the piece of information that it wants to attend to or focus on, and usually it focuses on the information that it thinks is the most important or necessary or meaningful. So this guy, George Miller, was interested in discovering how much information we can store at one time in our short-term memory. And so he did an experiment where he would read people numbers and then have them recite the numbers back in order. And the numbers were random numbers, 21, 57, 43. And then he'd ask them to recite those numbers back to him in order. And what he found was that we can hold what he referred to as the magic number 7 in our short-term memory. So 7 pieces of information can be held in our short-term memory at once. However, he said that this number 7, this magic number 7, had a standard deviation of 2, meaning that we can store anywhere from 5 to 9 pieces of information, or 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information in our short-term memory at a time. So there is a way that we can trick our short-term memory into holding more than the magic number 7 items. So we can hold more than 7 items in our short-term memory by chunking. And chunking is a process of recoding or reorganizing the information into meaningful units. So if you look at the screen, you'll see that there are 21 letters on the screen. But there is a way to put these letters into meaningful units, exactly 7 meaningful units, in order to help us remember them. And so we can put them into these 7 units, or what we could call chunks. So by chunking the information, we're able to remember more bits of information because we're transferring them into meaningful units of information. In this case, 7 meaningful units. And so these 21 letters can become 7 television stations. So what constitutes a chunk varies from person to person. In one experiment, they took a chessboard just like the one you see on the screen and showed them pieces arranged on the chessboard like on the left-hand side of your screen. And so they allowed the people to look at this for a period of time, and then they knocked all the pieces off the board and said, now put them back where they were. And so if I were to do this experiment, I would be looking at these pieces, and I am not a chess player, so I would just be seeing like a Burger King hat and a pony, and I would put them back probably somewhat unsuccessfully. And that's what the experiment found, that inexperienced chess players were only able to place 40% of the pieces back correctly. Whereas experienced players were able to place back 90% of the pieces correctly. And when asked how they did it, they talked about the moves that they would make if this were how the chessboard would set up, and they knew the terminology of the rook and the king and the queen and their association to one another and what they did, and so they were able to put all of these pieces into chunks in their mind, meaningful units, based on where they would play them and things like that. And this is what allowed them to place so many of them back correctly. So what would be a chunk for them, because they understand the game and they can make meaningful units, I could not make a chunk because I don't understand the game of chess or know anything about it. So we were just talking about short-term memory from the information processing model, but there is an alternative theory of short-term memory where it's maybe better described as working memory. And actually this model has gained a lot of momentum. It's becoming a lot more popular. So rather than viewing short-term memory as being a place for memories to kind of either pass through or fade, like with the information processing model, working memory views memories as more of an active process when they are in short term. And so the definition of working memory is a set of active, temporary memory stores that actively manipulate and rehearse information. And so it's a information processing center that manages new material from sensory memory and old information pulled in from long-term memory. So a part of the working memory theory is this idea that it contains a central executive processor. And the central executive processor in working memory controls, coordinates, and interprets the interaction of three systems. And those three systems are the visual store, the verbal store, and the episodic buffer. And so the visual store of the working memory specializes in visual and spatial information analogous to like a sketch pad. And then the verbal store in the working memory holds and manipulates material related to speech, words, and numbers, kind of like a audio recorder. And then there is the episodic buffer of working memory, which contains information that represents episodes or events, perhaps in your life, that are both visual and auditory. And so the central executive processor in working memory controls all of these three stores to help us actively recall information. Okay, so imagine that you are at the club and you are there with your friends. You guys have bottle service, so you have like an area where you have all your stuff set down, your bags and your phone, and there's a guy watching it for you. So you're VIP tonight. All right, so you're at the club, and across the way you spot a fly young honey. So you moonwalk over, and you guys are dancing, and as the night goes on, you're falling more and more in love with each other as you twerk the night away. And so she or he says to you, "Hey, I'd really like to continue talking to you. Let me give you my number." So you pat your pockets and you realize you don't have your phone on you. You don't have anything to record their number with. So you say to this sweet angel, "Hold on, I gotta go get my phone so I can write down your number." So they say to you, "Well, I gotta go, so let me just give it to you real quick. Just try to remember it. My number is 555-1212. And so your plan is that you are just going to run across the club as quickly as you possibly can because you learned that short-term memory is only 20 to 30 seconds long. So you're just going to go for it. So you start running across the club and instinctively you just start reciting the number in your head. 555-1212, 555-1212. And you're running across the club as fast as you can when your friend, who looks like Kevin Bacon, pops up out of nowhere and says to you, "Hey, in 30 seconds, we're going to do 4 shots of tequila. You got to be 21, but it's going to be a special at midnight where they're only $3 each. Are you up for it?" And you're like, "Oh man, I just lost that whole number that I had been memorizing as I was trying to run across the club." Okay, so 2 things have happened here. The first of which is a good thing. So in short-term memory, there's a concept known as rehearsal. And rehearsal is just the repetition of information that you have in your short-term memory. So as you were running across that club saying 555-1212, you were doing rehearsal. And actually, rehearsal is kind of an exception to that rule that short-term memory only lasts 20 to 30 seconds. Because the truth is, as long as you're rehearsing the information, it will stay in your short-term memory, which explains how you can cram for a test, and then as you're taking the test, you're doing rehearsal, so you're just repeating the information over and over and over, and then you turn your test in, and all that information is gone, right? That's because the moment you stop rehearsing it, it goes away. And so one of the things that can be really problematic with rehearsal and in short-term memory in general is this concept of interference. So when your friend jumped up from behind the bar looking like Kevin Bacon and started spouting off a bunch of numbers to you, that interfered with your ability to maintain those numbers in your short-term memory. And so interference is when you are taking in information that exceeds that magic number 7, and it's particularly problematic when that information is similar in characteristic to the information that you're rehearsing. Have you ever done that thing where you go into a room to get something and then you ask yourself, wait, why did I come in this room again? So these two concepts of rehearsal and interference can help us to better understand what's going on there. So imagine that you're sitting on the couch and you're like, oh, I need a ruler. So you get up and you start walking to the room, and on your walk over there, you're like, oh, look at that pile of laundry I have to do. Oh, look at that picture of me on my wedding day. My hair looked great. And then you get to that room, and once you're there, you can't remember what it was that you needed. So a couple things could have happened here. Maybe you live in a large house and it took longer than 20 to 30 seconds, the length of your short-term memory, to get to that room. And so you forgot what you needed and you didn't rehearse on the way there. And so when you got to the room, you couldn't remember. And then another thing that could have happened is as you were walking to that room, you saw the pile of laundry, you saw your picture from your wedding day, and interference occurred, also preventing you from remembering what it was you needed. So the fix to that would be to either run to the room so that you get there before the 20 to 30 seconds is up, or rehearsing the whole way there, ruler, 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 and trying to have a singular focus so that you're not interfered with in any way. So the type of rehearsal that we're talking about here is called maintenance rehearsal, where you're just repeating the information over and over and over again. Ruler, 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 or the phone number, 555-1212. But when it comes to long-term memory, there's actually a different type of rehearsal that can help us to get information to store in our long-term memory for much longer. And this type of rehearsal is called elaborative rehearsal. So elaborative rehearsal isn't just repetition, but instead it's considering the information in some meaningful fashion, fitting it into a logical framework, linking it to a memory or an image. I once met a person that told me he was a professor and he could remember all of the students' names in his courses, and I was really astounded by this because I know I certainly can't do it. And I asked him how he was doing that, and he told me that he has this trick where he will take a person and say their name is Stephanie, and then he'll think of someone he knows with that same name interacting with this new person that he just met. So maybe they're shopping together, or maybe they're just hanging out or whatever. But by creating an association between someone he knows with that name and this new person he met with that name, he's able to remember that name better. And so that is elaborative rehearsal. But as it relates to long-term memory, we know that long-term memories don't have a limit in terms of how long they can be stored. Whereas with short term, it's 20 to 30 seconds. Sensory memory is just a few seconds. With long term, essentially, these informations could, in theory, be stored forever. And with short term memory, we know that you can store around 7 units of information at a time. But long term memory is thought to have an unlimited capacity. There is no limit to the amount of information that you can store in long term, or at least we haven't found the limit. One of the ways that you can increase the likelihood of remembering information that's stored in your long term memory is, of course, with elaborative rehearsal, but another way is with mnemonic devices. So, mnemonic devices can be songs, they can be acronyms, but they are formal techniques for organizing information in a way that makes it more likely to be remembered. In fact, much more likely. Mnemonic devices are extremely effective at getting information from short term to long term, and then also helping you to recall that information later on. So you might think about information that you haven't used since elementary school, things like the musical notes, or maybe even the planets, right? But if you remember the mnemonic devices, which you most likely will because that's how effective they are, then that information comes right back to you. So people often complain to me that their long-term memory is poor and ask me for advice on how to improve it. And I always respond to them with, well, what type of long-term memory is poor? Because generally people tend to be stronger in different types of long-term memory. Maybe procedural memory is better for them than declarative. So there are different types of long-term memory or long-term memory modules, And so the first type we're going to talk about is procedural memory. And procedural memory is memory for skills and habits. Riding a bike, hitting a baseball, this is your memory for how to do things. And then declarative memory is memory for factual information, names, faces, dates, facts. And there are two types of declarative long-term memory. There is semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory is memory for general knowledge and facts about the world as well as rules of logic. So like, how to do a math problem or the capital of California or the zip code for Beverly Hills. Information that anyone could just Google and find out, but instead you have memorized is semantic memory. And then there is episodic memory. And episodic memory are memories about events in your life. So they're unique to your own individual personal experiences that you've had throughout life. And episodic memory is what allows us to remember things that have happened a really long time ago. So another way that we remember information that could be something that happened a long time ago or just any information is with what is known as semantic networks. This is one of the main ways that our long-term memory works. And so semantic networks are mental representations of clusters of interconnected information. So for example, you have kind of these categories in your brain: fruit, and then there's grapes, apples, pineapples. And these little clusters of information or fruit are considered semantic networks. And actually, one cluster can kind of trigger a connection to another cluster, especially based on your own personal experience. So maybe you see a bus, and this causes you to remember school, which causes you to remember psychology, which causes you to remember Professor Fell, which causes you to remember that she likes the Chargers. And so one thought can lead to another thought can lead to another thought, or one memory leading to another memory in a process called spreading activation. And so the process of spreading activation is where one memory triggers the activation of related memories. And so these related memories can kind of go across these clusters or across these semantic networks and just trigger other memories. So at this point in the lecture, I'd like you to go ahead and pause the video, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 1, and when you have finished that, come back to this exact spot in the video. See you then. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of neuroscience as it relates to memory. In chapter 2, or when we were looking at the biology of the brain, we discussed how the hippocampus is primarily responsible for memories. However, it's a little bit unfair to act as though the brain can be divvied up into these distinct categories. The brain really works together to create our experiences in life and to do their functions. So yes, the hippocampus tends to be a primary part of the brain focused on memory, but there are other parts of the brain that also play a role in memory. So the hippocampus actually helps to consolidate memories, to process them, where the cerebral cortex, particularly the temporal lobe, is where memories are stored and retrieved from. And then you have the amygdala, which is where a lot of the memories involving emotion are stored. So memories can be stored all over the brain. However, depending on the type of memory, they're going to be stored in specific parts. And there has been a question in neuroscience for a long time that asks, is there a physical memory trace, a tangible, visible semantic network in the brain? And this tangible, visible semantic network, this physical memory trace, is referred to as the engram. Recently, neuroscientists believe that they have actually found the engram in the hippocampus of mice. So it's an interesting idea that has a lot of implications, because if we can see a physical representation of a memory in a brain, and maybe that memory is traumatic, is there a way to then remove that physical memory, so that you can no longer recall it. There's actually some science going on now where they're looking at this, and they are removing neurons that create these engrams. And so they've had some success in doing this. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes of that research. Okay, check out this video.
On September 1st, 1953, William Scoville used a hand crank and a cheap drill saw to bore into a young man's skull, cutting away vital pieces of his brain and sucking them out through a metal tube. But this wasn't a scene from a horror film or a gruesome police report. Dr. Scoville was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of his time, and the young man was Henry Molaison, the famous patient known as HM, whose case provided amazing insights into how our brains work. As a boy, Henry had cracked his skull in an accident and soon began having seizures, blacking out, and losing control of bodily functions. After enduring years of frequent episodes and even dropping out of high school, the desperate young man had turned to Dr. Scoville, a daredevil known for risky surgeries. Partial lobotomies had been used for decades to treat mental patients, based on the notion that mental functions were strictly localized to corresponding brain areas. Having successfully used them to reduce seizures in psychotics, Scoville decided to remove HM's hippocampus, a part of the limbic system that was associated with emotion, but whose function was unknown. At first glance, the operation had succeeded. HM's seizures virtually disappeared, with no change in personality, and his IQ even improved. But there was one problem. His memory was shot. Besides losing most of his memories from the previous decade, HM was unable to form new ones, forgetting what day it was, repeating comments, and even eating multiple meals in a row. When Scoville informed another expert, Wilder Penfield, of the results, he sent a PhD student named Brenda Milner to study HM at his parents' home, where he now spent his days doing odd chores and watching classic movies for the first time, over and over. What she discovered through a series of tests and interviews didn't just contribute greatly to the study of memory. It redefined what memory even meant. One of Milner's findings shed light on the obvious fact that although HM couldn't form new memories, he still retained information long enough from moment to moment to finish a sentence or find the bathroom. When Milner gave him a random number, he managed to remember it for 15 minutes by repeating it to himself constantly. But only 5 minutes later, he forgot the test had even taken place. Neuroscientists had thought of memory as monolithic, all of it essentially the same, and stored throughout the brain. Milner's results were not only the first clue for the now familiar distinction between short-term and long-term memory, but showed that each uses different brain regions. We now know that memory formation involves several steps. After immediate sensory data is temporarily transcribed by neurons in the cortex, it travels to the hippocampus, where special proteins work to strengthen the cortical synaptic connections. If the experience was strong enough, or we recall it periodically in the first few days, the hippocampus then transfers the memory back to the cortex for permanent storage. HM's mind could form the initial impressions, but without a hippocampus to perform this memory consolidation, they eroded like messages scrawled in sand. But this was not the only memory distinction Milner found. In a now famous experiment, she asked HM to trace a third star in the narrow space between the outlines of two concentric ones, while he could only see his paper and pencil through a mirror. Like anyone else performing such an awkward task for the first time, he did horribly. But surprisingly, he improved over repeated trials, even though he had no memory of previous attempts. His unconscious motor centers remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. What Milner had discovered was that the declarative memory of names, dates, and facts is different from the procedural memory of riding a bicycle or signing your name. And we now know that procedural memory relies more on the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that were intact in HM's brain. This distinction between knowing that and knowing how has underpinned all memory research since. HM died at the age of 82 after a mostly peaceful life in a nursing home. Over the years, he had been examined by more than 100 neuroscientists, making his the most studied mind in history. Upon his death, his brain was preserved and scanned before being cut into over 2,000 individual slices and photographed to form a digital map down to the level of individual neurons, all in a live broadcast watched by 400,000 people. Though H.M. spent most of his life forgetting things, he and his contributions to our understanding of memory will be remembered for generations to come.
So because long-term memory has an unlimited capacity for information, this can make it really difficult to remember information sometimes, as exemplified by what we call the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And the tip of the tongue phenomenon is the inability to recall information that one realizes one knows as a result of the difficulty of retrieving information from long-term memory. So I'm sure you've had that experience before where it's like, oh my gosh, this word is right on the tip of my tongue. I know what this is called, but you can't find it. You can't find that word. And then finally it slips out and you're like, oh, toaster, sweet relief. Another phenomenon that can affect the ability to recall long-term memory information is what's known as the serial position effect. And so the serial position effect says that recall depends on where items fall on a list. So there are two types of the serial position effect. There's the primacy effect and the recency effect. And the primacy effect is where information earlier on a list is easier to recall, and the recency effect is when information later on a list at the end of the list is easier to recall. So because long-term memory is so vast with an unlimited capacity, to sort through all of that information, we use retrieval cues. And retrieval cues are any stimulus that allows us to recall more easily information that is in our long-term memory. A retrieval cue can be a word, an emotion, a sound, or a smell. Retrieval cues are especially important when asked to recall information versus to just recognize information. So when we are faced with a memory task in which specific information must be retrieved, for example, if we needed an answer on an essay test or a fill-in-the-blank test, then we would use recall. When we are given a memory task in which we're presented with a stimulus and asked whether or not we have been exposed to that stimulus before, or asked to identify it from a list of alternatives, then what we're doing is recognition. For example, like a police lineup. Recognition is not always perfect and can lead to false positives. False positives are an error in recognition in which people think that they recognize some stimulus that is not actually in memory. And we'll talk about incorrect eyewitness testimony later on in this chapter. So can you name the 7 dwarfs from Snow White and the 7 dwarfs? If you can, you're doing recall. But if you look at the slide, you'll see that there's a picture here of the 7 dwarfs. And now if I ask you to name the 7 dwarfs, it might become a little easier because you're identifying them by using the retrieval cue of the picture. And if I were to give you this list of names, then it should become even easier to recognize the names of the 7 dwarfs. So asking you what the names of the 7 dwarfs are without any stimulus present is recall, but giving you some stimuli in which you can use to help you find the correct names of the 7 dwarfs is recognition. And so recognition is simpler because it involves fewer mental steps, and recall is a lot harder because it involves a process. You have to search through your memory, retrieve the relevant information, make decisions, etc. So just remember that recognition is easier than recall, and you can remember that by thinking that you would rather have a multiple choice test, which is recognition, than an essay test, which would be recall. So there is what is known as explicit memory and implicit memory. And explicit memory is a place in your long-term memory that you can intentionally or consciously recollect information from, like trying to remember a name or a date. But there's also implicit memory. And implicit memory is memories of which people are not consciously aware that they have. But these memories can affect subsequent performance and behavior. For example, disliking someone and you don't know why. Maybe it's because they remind you of someone you didn't like that you don't remember. And they're a part of your implicit memory. Implicit memories are interesting because they're related closely with prejudice and discrimination. People often say they are not prejudiced, but when we study implicit memories in psychology, we find otherwise. And so people sometimes have memories or ideas about race that they're not consciously aware of that can lead to them engaging in some negative behavior. Implicit memories are often procedural, and so when we hear that saying that you never forget how to ride a bike, that is in part because you have stored that as an implicit memory. And when we have that experience where we can't remember where we just put our car keys, but a song comes on the radio that we haven't heard in 10 years and we know every lyric, that could be because those song lyrics are part of your implicit memory. And while you're not consciously thinking about those lyrics on a day-to-day basis, your long-term memory has the ability to store them. The main way that we study implicit memory is through what's called priming. Priming is a phenomenon in which exposure to a word or a concept, called a prime, later makes it easier to recall information, even when there is no conscious memory of the word or concept. In one study on priming and implicit memory, participants were shown a series of pictures, and as they would see a picture, an adjective would flash just below it, and the adjective would flash on a screen so quickly that the people didn't even recollect seeing any of the adjectives, much faster than what you've seen here. So later, the participants were shown the pictures of the people again and asked to describe them. And sure enough, the majority of the participants described the person in the picture using the adjective that was the prime, even though they had no conscious recollection of ever seeing the prime in the first place. So let's watch this video on implicit memories.
There's a significant way in which early experiences shape adult behavior, and even and especially early experiences for which there's no recall memory. It turns out that there are two kinds of memory. There is explicit memory, which is recall. This is when you can call back facts, details, episodes, circumstances. But the structure in the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which encodes recall memory, it doesn't even begin to develop fully until a year and a half, and it's not fully developed till much later, which is why hardly anybody has any recall memory prior to 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is called implicit memory, which is in fact an emotional memory, where the emotional impact and the interpretation that the child makes of those emotional experiences is ingrained in the brain in the form of nerve circuits ready to fire without specific recall. So to give you a clear example, people who are adopted have a lifelong sense of rejection very often. They can't recall the adoption, they can't recall the separation of a birth mother, because there's nothing there to recall with. But the emotional memory of separation and rejection is deeply embedded in their brains. Hence, they're much more likely to experience a sense of rejection and a great emotional upset when they perceive themselves as being rejected than other people. That's not unique to people who are adopted, but it's particularly strong in them because of this function of implicit memory. People who are addicted, given that they, according to all the research literature, certainly in my experience, the hardcore addicts virtually were all significantly abused as children or suffered severe emotional loss. Their emotional or implicit memories are those of a world that's not safe and not helpful, caregivers who are not to be trusted, and relationships that are not safe enough to open up to vulnerably. And hence their responses tend to be to keep themselves separate from really intimate relationships, not to trust caregivers, doctors, and other people who are trying to help them, and generally see the world as an unsafe place. And that's strictly a function of implicit memory, which sometimes has to do with incidents they don't even recall. Infants who are born premature are often in incubators and various types of gadgetry and machinery for weeks and perhaps months. It's now known that if these children are touched and stroked on the back for just 10 minutes a day, that promotes their brain development. So human touch is essential for development. And in fact, infants who are never picked up will actually die. That's how much of a fundamental need being held is to human beings. In our society, there's an unfortunate tendency to tell parents not to pick up their kids, not to hold them, not to pick up babies who are crying for fear of spoiling them, or to encourage them to sleep through the night. You don't pick them up, which is just the opposite of what the child needs. And these children might go back to sleep because they give up and their brains just shut down as a way of defending against the vulnerability of being abandoned really by their parents. But their implicit memories will be that of a world that doesn't give a damn.
Flashbulb memories are interesting because they're kind of unique in that they are memories centered on a specific, important, or surprising event. And these memories are so vivid, it's as if they represented a snapshot of an event. So some common flashbulb memories are 9/11, September 11th, and then maybe your first car accident, your high school graduation. However, even though flashbulb memories seem very vivid, they actually do not contain every detail. And sometimes the details are incorrect. One time a study asked Americans who remembered seeing both planes hit on September 11th, and 73% of Americans said they did. But the truth is that we only had footage of the second plane hitting the tower on September 11th. It wasn't until September 12th that we had footage of the first plane. So although 73% of Americans remember seeing both planes hit the towers, no one actually did. And that shows that even with really, really vivid memories, we can have incorrect details. So flashbulb memories tell us that exceptional memories are more likely to be retrieved. The more distinct and personal the stimuli is, or the information is, the more likely it is to be recalled later. However, even with really distinct stimuli, sometimes we experience what's called source amnesia. And source amnesia occurs when an individual has memory for some material, a song, an outfit, a person, but can't remember where they encountered it before. The truth is, it can be really difficult to gauge the accuracy of the recollection of our memories. We know that human memory is fallible. In fact, one of the main problems is that humans engage in what's called constructive processes. And constructive processes are processes in which memories are influenced by the meaning we give to events. So our recollections are influenced by our guesses and inferences about its meaning. For example, if you forget details of your memory, usually you'll just make them up. That's true of most humans. And the way that we fill in the details, because our brain does have a tendency to want to make incomplete things complete, like we talked about in the law of closure, is based on our schemas. So schemas are organized bodies of information stored in memory that bias the way new information is interpreted, stored, and recalled. So we use schemas to reconstruct previous experiences using our understanding of the information, expectations, beliefs, attitudes, etc. Beginning in the 1940s and then again in the 1950s, a study was conducted by the gentleman you see pictured here. He was a psychologist by the name of Alport, and his colleague Postman, who's not pictured here, conducted a study where they flashed this picture to a participant, and so the picture flashed very briefly and the participant saw it for just a moment, and that participant was then asked to start a game of telephone where they would tell the next participant what they remembered seeing in the picture, and then that participant would tell the next participant what they had heard was in the picture, and so on and so forth. And of course, as you know, in the game of telephone, as the story is retold over and over again, details get lost. And so what Alpert and Postman were studying is how did people go about filling in those details? Did they just not say them, or did they make up new details, or what did they do? And actually what they found was that people that had forgotten details did start making up their own details, And because in this time racism was maybe even more pronounced than it is today, what they saw was that people filled in the missing details of their memory with racist schemas. So what was a picture of a white man holding a box cutter, the last person in the game of telephone stood up and said that what was in the picture was an African American holding a knife. Because when they thought of a crime being committed on a subway car, they thought of a African American person because they had their own racist schemas that they used to construct their memory or fill in the blanks. So we know that our memory is imperfect and certainly fallible. So then how much should we rely on memory in the courtroom? Well, this is Calvin Willis. He was accused of rape after 2 different people identified him. He spent 21 years in jail until DNA testing came out and proved that it wasn't him. He didn't commit that rape. So we actually make a lot of errors on recalling criminal activity, even when we are highly confident that we are right. We make errors in IDing suspects, errors discussing the details of the crime, especially when weapons are involved, because weapons tend to draw our attention and cause us to pay even less attention to what's going on. So let's take a look at this video here and see if you would make a good eyewitness in a courtroom.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So recall can be affected by the way investigators word questions as well. One study had participants watch a car accident on a video, so a video of a car accident, and then they were divided into 5 groups, and the investigators asked the groups of people about that car accident on the video by just altering one word. So the first group was asked about how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other, and they said around 30 miles per hour on average. The second group was asked about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Now the wording is becoming a little more aggressive, and the miles per hour went up above 30 miles per hour. The next group was asked how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other, and the miles went up. How fast were the cars going when they collided with each other? And then finally, the last group, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And this group said that the cars they saw in the video were going over 40 miles per hour. So they had all watched the same video, but their recollection was skewed just based on how they were asked questions by the investigators. Okay, let's go ahead and pause at this point in the video. Head on over to Moodle, complete the next lecture activity, and when you've finished, come back to this point in the lecture. According to Sigmund Freud, we also have what are called repressed memories. And these are recollections of events that are initially so shocking and traumatic that the mind responds by pushing them deep into the unconscious, where they may remain hidden, possibly throughout a person's lifetime, unless they are triggered usually through Freud's psychoanalytic therapy. There is some controversy over the legitimacy of repressed memories. There are specific regions of the brain that can keep memories from coming to awareness. However, there's really not a ton of evidence that actual repressed memories exist. There are also false memories, and false memories develop when people are unable to recall the source of a memory of a particular event about which they really only have vague recollections. Generally, people become confused about whether they actually experience the event or if they are just imagining it. And when they become confused, usually they determine that they experienced it. So the leading researcher on false memories is Elizabeth Loftus. She actually works at UC Irvine, and she has done some really interesting research on false memories and how easy they are to obtain and create within our own memory. So let's take a look at this TED Talk with Elizabeth Loftus.
I'd like to tell you about a legal case that I worked on involving a man named Steve Titus. Titus was a restaurant manager. He was 31 years old. He lived in Seattle, Washington. He was engaged to Gretchen, about to be married. She was the love of his life. And one night, the couple went out for a romantic restaurant meal. They were on their way home, and they were pulled over by a police officer. You see, Titus's car sort of resembled a car that was driven earlier in the evening by a man who raped a female hitchhiker. And Titus kind of resembled that rapist. So the police took a picture of Titus. They put it in a photo lineup. They later showed it to the victim, and she pointed to Titus's photo. She said, "That one's the closest." The police and the prosecution proceeded with a trial, and when Steve Titus was put on trial for rape, the rape victim got on the stand and said, "I'm absolutely positive that's the man." And Titus was convicted. He proclaimed his innocence. His family screamed at the jury. His fiancée collapsed on the floor sobbing, and Titus is taken away to jail. So what would you do at this point? What would you do? Well, Titus lost complete faith in the legal system, and yet he got an idea. He called up the local newspaper. He got the interest of an investigative journalist, and that journalist actually found the real rapist, a man who ultimately confessed to this rape, a man who was thought to have committed 50 rapes in that area, and when this information was given to the judge set Titus free. And really, that's where this case should have ended. It should have been over. Titus should have thought of this as a horrible year, a year of accusation and trial, but over. It didn't end that way. Titus was so bitter, he'd lost his job, he couldn't get it back. He lost his fiancée, she couldn't put up with his persistent anger. He lost his entire savings, and so he decided to file a lawsuit against the police and others whom he felt were responsible for his suffering. And that's when I really started working on this case, trying to figure out how did that victim go from "that one's the closest" to "I'm absolutely positive that's the guy." Well, Titus was consumed with his civil case as he spent every waking moment thinking about it, and just days before he was to have his day in court, he woke up in the morning, doubled over in pain, and died of a stress-related heart attack. He was 35 years old. So I was asked to work on Titus's case because I'm a psychological scientist. I study memory. I've studied memory for decades. And if I meet somebody on an airplane, this happened on the way over to Scotland, if I meet somebody on an airplane and we ask each other, "What do you do? What do you do?" and I say, "I study memory," they usually want to tell me how they have trouble remembering names, or they've got a relative who's got Alzheimer's or some kind of memory problem. But I have to tell them, I don't study when people forget. I study the opposite, when they remember things that didn't happen or remember things that were different from the way they really were. I study false memories. Unhappily, Steve Titus is not the only person to be convicted based on somebody's false memory. In one project in the United States. Information has been gathered on 300 innocent people, 300 defendants who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 10, 20, 30 years in prison for these crimes, and now DNA testing has proven that they're actually innocent. And when those cases have been analyzed, 3/4 of them are due to faulty memory, faulty eyewitness memory. Well, why? Like the jurors who convicted those innocent people and the jurors who convicted Titus, many people believe that memory works like a recording device. You just record the information, then you call it up and play it back when you want to answer questions or identify images. But decades of work in psychology has shown that this just isn't true. Our memories are constructive. They're reconstructive. Memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it, but so can other people. I first started studying this constructive memory process in the 1970s. I did my experiments that involved showing people simulated crimes and accidents and asking them questions about what they remember. In one study, we showed people a simulated accident, and we asked people how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And we asked other people how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And if we asked the leading smash question, the witnesses told us the cars were going faster. And moreover, that leading smashed question caused people to be more likely to tell us that they saw broken glass in the accident scene when there wasn't any broken glass at all. In another study, we showed a simulated accident where a car went through an intersection with a stop sign, and if we asked a question that insinuated it was a yield sign, many witnesses told us they remember seeing a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. And you might be thinking, well, you know, these are filmed events, they're not particularly stressful. Would the same kind of mistakes be made with a really stressful event? In a study we published just a few months ago, we have an answer to this question. Because what was unusual about this study is we arranged for people to have a very stressful experience. The subjects in this study were members of the US military who were undergoing a harrowing training exercise to teach them what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. And as part of this training exercise, these soldiers are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive fashion for 30 minutes. And later on, they have to try to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And when we feed them suggestive information that insinuates it's a different person, many of them misidentify their interrogator, often identifying someone who doesn't even remotely resemble the real interrogator. And so what these studies are showing is that when you feed people misinformation about some experience that they may have had, you can distort or contaminate or change their memory. Well, out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation not only if we're questioned in a leading way, but if we talk to other witnesses who might consciously or inadvertently feed us some erroneous information, or if we see media coverage about some event we might have experienced. All of these provide the opportunity for this kind of contamination of our memory. In the 1990s, we began to see an even more extreme kind of memory problem. Some patients were going into therapy with one problem, maybe they had depression, eating disorder, and they were coming out of therapy with a different problem. Extreme memories for horrific brutalization, sometimes in satanic rituals, sometimes involving really bizarre and unusual elements. One woman came out of psychotherapy believing that she'd endured years of ritualistic abuse, where she was forced into a pregnancy and that the baby was cut from her belly. But there were no physical scars or any kind of physical evidence that could have supported her story. And when I began looking into these cases, I was wondering, where do these bizarre memories come from? And what I found is that most of these situations involved some particular form of psychotherapy. And so I asked, were some of the things going on in this psychotherapy, like the imagination exercises, or dream interpretation, or in some cases hypnosis, or in some cases exposure to false information, were these leading these patients to develop these very bizarre, unlikely memories? And I designed some experiments to try to study the processes that were being used in this psychotherapy so I could study the development of these very rich false memories. In one of the first studies we did, we used suggestion, a method inspired by the psychotherapy we saw in these cases. We used this kind of suggestion and planted a false memory that when you were a kid, 5 or 6 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall. You were frightened, you were crying, you were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And we succeeded in planting this memory in the minds of about a quarter of our subjects. And you might be thinking, well, that's not particularly stressful. But we and other investigators have planted rich false memories of things that were much more unusual and much more stressful. So in a study done in Tennessee, researchers planted the false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. And in a study done in Canada, researchers planted the false memory that when you were a kid, something as awful as being attacked by a vicious animal happened to you, succeeding with about half of their subjects. And in a study done in Italy, researchers planted the false memory when you were a kid, you witnessed demonic possession. I do want to add that it might seem like we are traumatizing these experimental subjects in the name of science, but our studies have gone through thorough evaluation by research ethics boards that have made the decision that the temporary discomfort that some of these subjects might experience in these studies is outweighed by the importance of this problem for understanding memory processes and the abuse of memory that is going on in some places in the world. Well, to my surprise, when I published this work and began to speak out against this particular brand of psychotherapy, it created some pretty bad problems for me. Hostilities primarily from the repressed memory therapists who felt under attack and by the patients whom they had influenced. I had sometimes armed guards at speeches that I was invited to give, people trying to drum up letter writing campaigns to get me fired. But probably the worst was I suspected that a woman was innocent of abuse that was being claimed by her grown daughter. She accused her mother of sexual abuse based on a repressed memory. And this accusing daughter had actually allowed her story to be filmed and presented in public places. I was suspicious of this story, and so I started to investigate and eventually found information that convinced me that this mother was innocent. I published an expose on the case, and a little while later, the accusing daughter filed a lawsuit. Even though I'd never mentioned her name, she sued me for defamation and invasion of privacy. And I went through nearly 5 years of dealing with this messy, unpleasant litigation. But finally, it was over, and I could really get back to my work. In the process, however, I became part of a disturbing trend in America where scientists are being sued for simply speaking out on matters of great public controversy. When I got back to my work, I asked this question: If I plant a false memory in your mind, does it have repercussions? Does it affect your later thoughts, your later behaviors? Our first study planted a false memory that you got sick as a child, eating certain foods, hard-boiled eggs, dill pickles, strawberry ice cream, and we found that once we planted this false memory, people didn't want to eat the foods as much at an outdoor picnic. The false memories aren't necessarily bad or unpleasant. If we planted a warm, fuzzy memory involving a healthy food like asparagus, we could get people to want to eat asparagus more. And so what these studies are showing is that you can plant false memories and they have repercussions that affect behavior long after the memories take hold. Well, along with this ability to plant memories and control behavior, obviously comes some important ethical issues. Like, when should we use this mind technology, and should we ever ban its use? Therapists can't ethically plant false memories in the mind of their patients, even if it would help the patient. But there's nothing to stop a parent from trying this out on their overweight or obese teenager. And when I suggested this publicly, it created outcry again. There she goes. She's advocating that parents lie to their children. Hello, Santa Claus. I mean, another way another way to think about this is, which would you rather have? A kid with obesity, diabetes, shortened lifespan, all the things that go with it, or a kid with one little extra bit of false memory? I know what I would choose for a kid of mine. But maybe my work has made me different from most people. Most people cherish their memories, know that they represent their identity, who they are, where they came from. And I appreciate that. I feel that way too. But I know from my work how much fiction is already in there. If I've learned anything from these decades of working on these problems, it's this. Just because somebody tells you something and they say it with confidence, just because they say it with lots of detail, just because they express emotion when they say it, it doesn't mean that it really happened. We can't reliably distinguish true memories from false memories. We need independent corroboration. Such a discovery has made me more tolerant of the everyday memory mistakes that my friends and family members make. Such a discovery might have saved Steve Titus, the man whose whole future was snatched away by a false memory. But meanwhile, we should all keep in mind, we do well to, that memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Autobiographical memories are our recollections of circumstances and episodes from our own lives. We tend to forget information about our past that is incompatible with how we currently see ourselves. Well-adjusted adults forget troubling childhood events. College students don't remember their bad grades, but do remember their good. Older people like to remember periods of life where major transitions occurred better than middle-aged times. So they like to remember when they started college, a job that was important to them, getting married, things like that. And there are people who have a memory disorder, although some might argue that it's actually quite enabling, where they have an excellent autobiographical memory, abnormally good, like Mary Lou Henner.
Well, let's put this to the test, because I find this gripping. So, if I was to say to you, what did you do on August the 16th, 1977?
Oh, okay, August the 16th of 1977. I was just flying back from Las Vegas. My boyfriend at the time, Lloyd Allen, was performing there in Vegas at the Aladdin Hotel. I was flying back, and I was driving from the airport, and I found out, and that was a 77, that was a Tuesday, and I heard on the radio that Elvis Presley had died.
My God!
Isn't that the truth?
I mean,
yes.
Look, it's shocking to me you can remember that Elvis died that day, because even though I vaguely knew it was the end of the 70s, the fact that you remember your day Is even more extraordinary.
No, and I remember where I ate the night before. I remember over that weekend, at one point, he was in the show Grease, and the car during Grease Lightning went off and into somebody's table. I mean, it's like all of a sudden everything starts flooding back for me.
So why do we forget? Why don't we all remember everything like Mary Lou Henner? So there's 4 possible explanations for why we forget. The first one is just failure to encode properly. Maybe we never brought the information in the first place. So if you look at your screen and I were to ask you which coin is the correct coin, it'd be very difficult for you to get the answer right because, just like the coins we talked about earlier in the lecture, we don't study them and try to remember them because we don't find that information meaningful. Therefore, we never really encode it, even though we've seen it thousands of times. So the correct answer is actually coin A. Another theory of why we forget is decay, which is just the loss of information through its non-use. As the old adage goes, if you don't use it, you lose it. Another possible explanation of how we forget is interference, which is the phenomenon by which information in memory disrupts the recall of other information, like we talked about earlier. And the next theory is cue-dependent forgetting. So cue-dependent forgetting is the forgetting that occurs when there are insufficient retrieval cues to rekindle information in memory. If you lose your keys, you're trying to retrace your steps, but you can't retrace all your steps because you have insufficient retrieval cues. Most psychologists think that interference and cue-dependent forgetting are really the key processes in forgetting. Okay, let's watch this video on forgetting.
It's early Monday morning and you realize you forgot to pick up your dry cleaning, you can't find your keys, and you have no idea what your Facebook password is. As you start to panic, it feels like your memory kind of sucks. But your brain is designed to forget, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Psychological theories try and make sense of why we forget pieces of information like all of our passwords. Decay theory suggests we can't retrieve information because, over time, traces of our memory fade away and eventually disappear. Interference theory suggests new memories compete with our existing ones. When new information is similar to a memory you already have, the new information interferes with your ability to recall that existing memory. And in some cases, we didn't even store a thought as a memory in the first place. Neuroscientists suggest many of these theories could be intertwined at a tiny molecular level in your brain. We have a forgetting protein in our brains called Musashi. It messes with the function of our synapses, structures that let nerve cells communicate with each other. Another protein called adenosine has the opposite effect and actually stimulates the growth of our synapses. Remembering and forgetting thoughts is like a street fight between Musashi and adenosine. Their interaction and who wins depends on whether our thoughts transmitted across our synapses are stabilized and stored permanently in our memory. In one study, researchers genetically modified some ringworms so their brains didn't contain Musashi. Let's just call them Teenage Mutant Ninja ringworms. The regular and mutant worms learned new information just as well, but the mutant worms, without Musashi, had a much better recall of information. They were less forgetful. By removing the forgetting protein, we learn more about how it works. It could help us understand disorders where people lose their memories, like Alzheimer's, and how to treat them. But sadly, we can't go removing Musashi from our brains to have a super-powered memory. Our brains forget on purpose. We need to forget because the ability to lose information keeps our brains flexible so they can absorb new things. If we didn't forget, we'd constantly recall all kinds of random extraneous information and we wouldn't be able to focus on the present. Forgetting your passwords is frustrating, but it's totally normal. As we go about our daily lives, we subconsciously find a balance between remembering and forgetting. So a brain fart or a senior's moment isn't all that bad. Forgetting actually helps you remember. If you haven't already, subscribe to Braincraft for a new brainy episode every Thursday.
Except for Alzheimer's disease, memory disorders are relatively rare. But Alzheimer's disease affects about 5 million people, and it's an illness characterized in part by severe memory problems. It usually starts with forgetting birthdays, then how to use a phone, then how to speak, until physical deterioration occurs, leading to death. The cause of Alzheimer's is not fully understood. However, we do know that it's related to a reduction in the production of a protein needed to make nerve cell connections. Let's watch a video on Alzheimer's.
What is Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's is a slow, fatal disease of the brain affecting 1 in 10 people over the age of 65. No one is immune. The disease comes on gradually as 2 abnormal protein fragments called plaques and tangles accumulate in the brain and kill brain cells. They start here in the hippocampus, the part of the brain where memories are first formed. Over many years' time, the plaques and tangles slowly destroy the hippocampus, and it becomes harder and harder to form new memories. Simple recollections from a few hours or days ago that the rest of us might take for granted are just not there. After that, more plaques and tangles spread into different regions of the brain, killing cells and compromising function wherever they go. This spreading around is what causes the different stages of Alzheimer's. From the hippocampus, the disease spreads here to the region of the brain where language is processed. When that happens, it gets tougher and tougher to find the right word. Next, the disease creeps toward the front of the brain, where logical thought takes place. Very gradually, a person begins to lose the ability to solve problems, grasp concepts, and make plans. Next, the plaques and tangles invade the part of the brain where emotions are regulated. When this happens, the patient gradually loses control over moods and feelings. After that, the disease moves to where the brain makes sense of things it sees, hears, and smells. In this stage, Alzheimer's wreaks havoc on a person's senses and can spark hallucinations. Eventually, the plaques and tangles erase a person's oldest and most precious memories, which are stored here in the back of the brain. Near the end, the disease compromises a person's balance and coordination, and in the very last stage, it destroys the part of the brain that regulates breathing and the heart. The progression from mild forgetting to death is slow and steady, and takes place over an average of 8 to 10 years. It is relentless and, for now, incurable. Helping your family, friends, and neighbors to better understand Alzheimer's will reduce stigma, improve care, and even help the fight for a cure. Thanks for helping to do your part. Learn more at www.aboutalz.org.
Amnesia is memory loss that occurs without other mental difficulties, and there's 2 types of amnesia. There's retrograde amnesia, which is memory loss for occurrences prior to a certain event, like brain trauma. This is the kind you usually see in movies, like the movie Overboard, for example. How long the amnesia will last and what they will remember really depends on the person. And then there is anterograde amnesia, and this is memory loss for events that follow an injury. People can't remember their current activities because the information can't be transferred from short term to long term. This is the type of amnesia that you saw on 50 First Dates. The next memory disorder we're going to talk about is Korsakoff syndrome, which is due to alcoholism, and it results in an amnesia-like situation, leaving some abilities intact, but can also include hallucinations and a tendency to repeat the same story. Okay, that concludes the lecture on memory. You'll want to go over to Moodle and complete lecture activity number 3. And don't forget to make your forum post. And that is it. So we will see you next time. Have a great rest of the week.